Welcome to another episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod. Scientists believe babies could be nurtured in external artificial wombs in the future. If so, what might the implications be? For some people, the very thought may conjure ideas of small Frankenstein's monster. For others, it could represent an opportunity to save more extreme preterm babies in a significantly safer environment than that afforded by conventional incubators. Premature birth before 37 weeks, is globally the biggest cause of death among newborns. The technology could also provide a safe way for couples to have children where other interventions are not possible. And it might even allow mothers to keep working throughout their pregnancy without experiencing the physical symptoms. Does all this seem far-fetched? To date, experiments have been conducted on rodents and sheep, with human trials anticipated in 10 years. The big questions around these technologies revolve around the social and ethical implications. And I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast futurist Alexandra Whittington to discuss these issues. Alex, welcome back. Remind us what you do, if you would, first of all, please.
Hi, Steve. Thank you for having me back. I'm a futurist. I'm based out of the US here in Houston, Texas. And I am in a team called the Future of Business at TCS, Tata Consultancy Services. And I'm also an author, speaker, and just general creative thinker, I guess, when it comes to the future.
I can certainly vouch for that. So let's get into this, because this is a completely fascinating notion, I think, and one that I always think as soon as technologies like this hit the BBC, they kind of hit the mainstream. And that's when you realize these things are really possible. So how might this technology evolve, do you think, to benefit women and babies? I kind of outlined some brief ideas, but what are your thoughts?
Well, this is actually a technology that I've been monitoring for some time because as a futurist, I'm quite interested in the future of women, families, children, and healthcare. And I think that it does have some pros and cons. Of course, the idea of being able to sustain a delicate, fragile newborn life, particularly for premature babies, that's the whole point of advanced technology, right? I mean, we come up with these ideas and these breakthroughs so that we can help people. But at the same time, there may be some harmful elements in terms of, what it does to the, let's say, the quality of the pregnancy or childbirth experience. I think there's a lot to be said for the natural way of doing it. There's a lot going on in the womb that we don't quite understand yet as far as the person's or child's development. So I would want to point out both sides on this. But I think that, most importantly, the ability to preserve a pregnancy, to keep a baby alive at an earlier stage than we were, previously able to, that's a huge advantage. And I do think there are some positive sides to being able to, let's say, avoid the negative or dangerous elements of pregnancy and childbirth. Here in the US, we're a very developed country, but we have some of the worst maternal mortality rates in the industrialized world. And those have a lot to do with economic and social inequalities. So I think that if a technology such as artificial womb could overcome social and economic inequalities, that's a definite plus. But again, I would point out that we don't have a great, from what I know, we don't have the great understanding of everything that's going on developmentally in the womb and the importance of the experience of, hearing voices from inside the womb, the heartbeat, the different processes that are happening. So it's, something that we need to proceed with caution. That's what I would say.
For me, the big ticket items there that you spoke about is one, do we actually understand enough about this part of human biology to replicate it in an artificial, a digital, a technology world? And the other is this issue of health intervention, and if it can be created as a safe health intervention, that's obviously a positive. Then there's a question of equitable access to that health intervention, isn't it?
Definitely. I think this goes along with some of the other technologies that futurists like to explore, such as the life extension technologies. if I can draw a parallel there. And they're great, right? It sounds great to live this long, healthy life, unlike what we can naturally achieve. But there's a sense of privilege that goes along with that. I mean, you have to be able to afford to live that long. Some people are barely able to scrape through a normal lifespan. And we do know that shorter lifespans are associated with decreased economic privileges. So I think that there's this element there as far as who will have access to it, and what I have heard called the transgender community. There's other terms for this, but the non traditional definition of a woman could have access to pregnancy and childbirth through this technology. And I do think that there are health conditions that prevent women from being able to become mothers, and this might be an advantage in that sense.
Yeah, certainly one of the things that struck me was, does this open up an opportunity for same-sex couples beyond adoption or surrogacy, for example? I mean, I think you started to touch on them, but what do you see as some of the real ethical issues here? Because the ones we touched on are access to this, but I guess there are also potentially some ethical issues associated with the experimentation in the development of the technologies, aren't there?
Sure. I mean, I think we can all sort of tap into mentally, an image of this sci-fi dystopia where I don't know, an evil millionaire or billionaire, gets their hands on this technology and just starts cranking out human beings for some illicit purpose, whether it's slavery or something similar. So obviously, there's a danger in being able to, I don't know, mass produce people, right? That's a big ethical pitfall right there. So I would say that's one. Not to mention that, y- I guess ideally, a child is brought into the world to be welcomed into a family that wants it. And I guess I would really be curious about why even a family would have the motivation to get into this kind of way of obtaining a child, right? So it just might open up new doors. Similar to the adoption screening process, perhaps there may be a whole slew of questions, personality traits, maybe even DNA or biological testing that you would have to undergo to determine if you're qualified to use an artificial womb technology.
I mean, you're starting to kind of touch on the next question I've got, which is, might this technology be combined with others? And the one that immediately come to my mind was gene editing, to create both positive and arguably very disturbing views of the future.
Yeah, it's one of those technologies that, as you might say, gives us godlike powers,
Yeah.
right? The ability to create life. And that's a Pandora's box when it comes to humanity. So I think that anything where we're, creating new life, taking on control of the direction of society in terms of, population growth or the function or purpose of a human life, it's a dangerous territory. But as futurists, it's our job to look at all the corners and say, okay, this could happen, that could happen. How would we respond in these different circumstances? So it's important to have the discussion. And I think that we do need to somehow find the positives as
Yeah.
well, the health benefits, the social benefits, and the possibility that we'll use this to enhance humanity rather than degrade it.
And what do you think is behind that opportunity to enhance humanity? Is it access to the technology for those people that, for no fault of their own, can't have children? Is it that kind of thing that you're thinking of there?
I'm thinking of that, yes, and the people who might be marginalized for social reasons, from having children, whether it's same-sex couples or non-traditional gender identities. And society is changing. Uh, Childbirth rates are declining all over the Western world. So there may be some economic benefit. Again, treading that dangerous territory of dehumanizing people. But there is a growing need to encourage population growth. Yeah, I just read how in Japan they're actively paying young people to move into communities where there aren't any young people. Young couples, I think under 30 or under 40, they're getting this stipend to move and live around the elderly. So, there are social programs, governmental programs that could exist to literally increase the birth rate simply for the demographic economic benefits.
That's interesting. The notion of populations that don't look set to meet future needs, particularly, I guess, future economic needs. And yet many people will point to the ability for more people to have babies artificially than ever before, added to the notion of ever increasing aging populations. And does that represent a potential strain on society that economically is not sustainable? But equally, it's much more complex than just one or the other, isn't it?
Definitely. In the US, we have something called the culture wars. And this involves a long-standing debate, which is pro-choice versus pro-life.
Yeah.
Pro-choice are the people who support legal abortion. Pro-life are the ones that are against it. I realize this is a very US concentrated problem, but I've always, made the argument that that culture war is really diminished by the bigger questions around these kinds of technologies, because it goes so much further than being pro-choice or pro-life when you're talking about an artificial womb. It really makes that debate seem small in
Yeah.
comparison, because it's not really pro-choice, pro-life anymore when you're talking about the ability to create a human being or gestate a human being through a technology with no human involvement whatsoever. All the other arguments sort of start to fizzle away.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious now. This is a bit of a sideways step, but I'm quite curious about your description of the culture war between the people supporting the idea of abortion and against it. Is it a culture war, do you think, or is it more precisely, could it be couched as a gender war?
That's a good question. I think it's been defined as a culture war
Yeah.
for 40 years, but it is, in a way, the pro-life, quote unquote, side is in a war against women. It's
Mm.
very fanatical, sort of a religiously fanatical viewpoint that women should really be at home having babies, taking care of their families, and doing nothing much else. So it's a misconstrued form of Christianity,
Yeah.
Christian fundamentalism that thinks that we need to go back to something that really never, was sustainable in the first place.
Yeah.
Certainly not in these modern times.
I mean, I want to end on a positive note, so I just want to go down a dystopian, small, not very deep rabbit hole, if we could, for a moment, because when I was thinking about the use of these technologies, and one of the things that you kind of alluded to earlier on, that reminded me of kind of a sort of a dystopian notion of baby factories. So, is some of the danger of these technologies, particularly when you start to combine them with things like gene editing, is the fear around kind of designer babies to order, the creation of some kind of superhuman race where we genetically engineered certain characteristics? Is that, if you like, a plausible fear that we should be careful about in the way that we design a regulatory framework to support the development and implementation of these technologies?
Yeah, I would argue that yes, we need to avoid personalizing people to the point where they become a consumer product, right? It's not a Tesla, it's it's a
Yeah.
person. So definitely say that,
That's a
that's
quote I'm going to use.
yes, I mean, I think that, we need to the designer baby trend has been ongoing for
Yeah.
decades at this point, but it hasn't really achieved the level that I think some futurists thought it might. For example, cloning, just to touch on another
Mm.
genetic technology, is something that apparently has sort of faded away in significance. Cloning has sort of ended, not ended, but it's sort of currently on a path of people cloning their pets.
Yeah.
Right. For a long time, people were worried we were going to be cloning our kids, we're going to be cloning ourselves, we're going to be cloning, Abraham Lincoln or something. And it turned out that, it's Barbara Streisand cloning her favorite dog is
Yeah.
basically the state of cloning at this point. So, I mean, we can't get a clear view of the future, but I would definitely say the personalization of human beings to be some object that we desire, because I think that opens up a really negative
Yeah.
future. I mean, I don't know if I've shared this story with you before, about a British dentist, if I'm not mistaken, purchased the extracted wisdom tooth of, I think it was John Lennon, right, who had already passed away. But someone, some celebrity auction, they had the tooth that belonged to one of the Beatles, and this guy was a huge Beatles fan. He bought the tooth. He paid millions and millions of dollars, right, for charity, but still. And they asked him, "Why did you buy that tooth? That's so random." And he said, "Well, I hope that one day genetic technology will advance to where I can clone John Lennon from the DNA in this tooth, and then I can fulfill my life's dream of jamming with John Lennon."
Wow.
And that's messed up, right? I mean, that's a cool kind of funny story, but we don't want people cloning their idol, be it a music idol or a sex idol or some other idol, for their own personal purposes. I think that's where it starts getting scary.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree with that. So I did say I wanted to end on a more positive note, because as you get a group of futurists in the room, and I very quickly go down this dystopian route. So thinking about some more positives. I mean, I go back to the equity really, and access to these kind of technologies. So if this technology can be used to provide access to childbearing for all, provide greater fluidity in gender roles, as well as help save babies that might otherwise die. There are so many positives to look at within this technology, as well as the things we should be wary and scared about, aren't there?
Yes, I definitely think so. Like all technologies, it's a double-edged sword, and it does have the potential to be used to give access, opportunities, and happiness to people who normally wouldn't. Something that we should continue to explore.
Well, Alex, it's been absolutely lovely to have you on the podcast again, and what a fascinating topic. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Steve.
And thank you, everyone, for listening. Do let your friends and colleagues know about the Informing Choices mini pod, and we'll have another episode for you very soon.